Our family abandoned us when my mom had cancer. It was the best thing that ever happened to us. When mom was diagnosed, I called every relative with money begging for help with treatment costs. My uncle with his Mercedes collection said we should have planned better. My aunt with the beach house said it wasn't her responsibility. My grandfather, who owned half the commercial real estate downtown, hung up when I started crying. They'd spent years bragging about their money, and now they wouldn't even show up. I posted on our neighborhood Facebook page about needing rides to the hospital, and within an hour, our elderly neighbor was at our door with a casserole and a driving schedule she'd already organized. She didn't even know us beyond waving hello. The next morning, 3 strangers showed up to deep clean our house so mom wouldn't get infections. Our landlord reduced our rent without us asking. The lunch lady at my little brother's school started packing extra food for him to bring home. None of these people had money, but they showed up every single day, while my rich relatives posted vacation photos from Italy. I watched my mother cry when her hairdresser came to our house to shave her head for free, and stayed to hold her while she sobbed. The mechanic fixed our car for free so we could get to treatments. The corner store owner started forgetting to charge us for groceries sometimes. These people were keeping us alive while my family pretended we didn't exist. During mom's second round of chemo, the waiting room became my education in how our city really worked. I met a woman whose son died because the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away. I met a man who lost his house to medical debt, even though he worked 3 jobs. Every person had a story about how the system failed them, while rich people like my family built another mall nobody needed. A young organizer was protesting about the closed health clinic and asked if I wanted to help since I was there every day anyway. I started going to city council meetings between mom's treatments and learned that my grandfather's company had lobbied to close the clinic because the land was valuable. The same grandfather who wouldn't give us a penny had stolen healthcare from thousands of people to build luxury apartments. I started keeping a notebook of every story and every injustice. By mom's last treatment, I had 200 pages of reasons to fight back. Mom went into remission after 8 months of hell, and our community threw a party in the park with food everyone had scraped together to buy. My uncle drove by in his Tesla and didn't even slow down. That night, the organizer asked if I'd ever thought about running for mayor since I knew everyone's struggles firsthand now. Within a month, I had 500 volunteers for my campaign, and every single one had a story about being abandoned by the system. The incumbent was my grandfather's golf buddy, who hadn't held a town hall in 6 years. Our campaign money came from bake sales and car washes, while his came from developers wanting to build luxury condos where the food bank stood. We knocked on every door in the district and registered 8,000 new voters who'd given up on the system. The polls showed us ahead by single digits but climbing every week. My volunteers worked 18-hour days because they believed we could actually change things. Mom became our unofficial mascot, and survivors would cry when they met her at rallies. We were winning in the polls by 15 points when my grandfather showed up at campaign headquarters with his lawyer. He hadn't spoken to me in 2 years, but now he looked scared. He said if I didn't drop out immediately, he'd evict every single volunteer who lived in one of his buildings. Turns out he owned half the apartment complexes in our district through shell companies nobody knew about. I have 43 of your volunteers on my tenant lists, he said, showing me the papers with names I recognized. Everyone gets 30 days notice tomorrow if you don't concede tonight. I told him that was illegal, but his lawyer laughed and said good luck proving retaliation when they'd all missed rent payments during medical emergencies. My volunteers didn't know their slumlord was my grandfather, and finding out would destroy the campaign anyway. He gave me until midnight to decide. I had 3 hours to choose between victory and keeping 43 families in their homes. Election night, we were ahead by 20 points when the fire alarm went off at our victory party. Everyone evacuated calmly until we saw the smoke pouring from the community center, where we'd stored all our voter registration drives and campaign records. The building where Mom had gotten free meals during chemo was burning. The place where her support group met was burning. The room where kids did homework while their parents worked 3 jobs was burning. Fire trucks arrived, but it was already gone. Everything inside destroyed. Then my phone buzzed with a text from my grandfather. Electrical fires are so common in old buildings. Another text appeared immediately. Your mother's oncologist works out of one of my medical buildings. A third text made my hands shake. So does the dialysis center where your neighbor gets treatment. A fourth. And the pharmacy where your volunteers get their insulin. Mom was celebrating our victory while I stared at the flames destroying the place that saved us. People were crying and hugging and taking pictures of the fire with their phones. My grandfather's final text arrived as the news called our landslide victory. Concede tomorrow, or I start having more electrical problems at the children's clinic. I stood there frozen with my phone screen still glowing with grandfather's threat about the children's clinic, while smoke filled the night sky behind me. Mom's celebration continued just 20 feet away, and I had maybe 10 seconds to decide how to handle this without destroying her moment of victory. My hands shook as I slipped the phone into my pocket and forced myself to smile, just as Mom rushed over with tears of joy streaming down her face. She hugged me tight while the fire trucks arrived with their sirens wailing, and I held her close while my mind raced through which volunteers lived in grandfather's buildings. The young organizer caught my eye from across the evacuation zone, and I subtly motioned her over while Mom turned to talk to other supporters about our landslide victory. We stepped aside near the yellow tape where firefighters were setting up their equipment, and I showed her the texts on my phone, watching her face go pale as she read each threat about the medical buildings and the children's clinic. She grabbed my arm, and we quickly agreed to delay any public concession while we figured out how to protect the volunteers at risk from illegal eviction. The organizer started making calls to find emergency legal help, while I kept Mom distracted by pointing out different supporters in the crowd and thanking them for their work. Within an hour, while the fire department sprayed water on the smoking ruins, the organizer connected us with Leo Ramos, who she said was a tenants' rights attorney who'd fought illegal evictions before. He agreed to meet us first thing in the morning at 7 and told us to document everything immediately before any evidence disappeared. I screenshot every text from grandfather and forwarded them to multiple email accounts, including one I created just for this purpose, while my hands shook with anger and fear. Then I took photos of the burning building from different angles, capturing the destruction of the place that had saved us during Mom's cancer treatment. Our campaign tech lead ran over with his laptop and started checking for any backup files since our physical voter registration records were gone with the building. He found partial voter lists in the cloud that he'd uploaded last week, but confirmed most of our organizing documents, including volunteer contact sheets, were only stored in the filing cabinets that were now ash. The crowd started thinning out as midnight approached, and I finally got Mom home and settled in her bed, choosing not to tell her about the threats yet, since stress could affect her remission. The guilt of keeping this from her fought with my need to protect her health, but I knew she'd insist on fighting if she knew what grandfather was doing. Once she was asleep, I texted our volunteer coordinators, asking them to privately check which of their team members rented from Westside Properties or Riverside Holdings, without explaining why yet. Within an hour, I had 43 names, including Estella Brooks, who'd led our biggest canvassing effort and knocked on over 2,000 doors herself. Midnight came and went, without any public statement from me about conceding, deliberately missing grandfather's deadline, while I sat at my kitchen table staring at the list of families he could destroy. The organizer texted that she was already coordinating with volunteers to prepare for possible eviction notices and had lawyers ready to file emergency injunctions in the morning. My phone stayed silent after midnight, which somehow felt worse than getting another threat, because now I didn't know what grandfather would do next. I spent the rest of the night going through our remaining campaign files on various computers and phones, trying to piece together what we'd lost in the fire. The tech lead sent me what he could recover, but it was maybe 20% of what we'd built over months of organizing. At 3 in the morning, I finally crashed on the couch for a few hours before meeting Leo Ramos, knowing that when I woke up, the real fight would begin. The community had elected me by 20 points, but grandfather still controlled the buildings where they lived and the clinics where they got medicine. I'd won the election, but he'd just shown me he could burn down everything I cared about if I didn't play by his rules. My phone rang at exactly 3 in the morning, and the organizer's voice was already talking before I could say hello. She had a whole plan worked out while I'd been lying on the couch staring at the ceiling. She'd already called 12 volunteers who were setting up emergency tenant meetings for the next day. She'd reached out to 3 different media contacts who covered housing issues. She talked for 10 minutes straight about turning grandfather's threats into our biggest weapon yet, while I took notes on the back of an envelope. By the time she hung up, I had 4 pages of action items, and my hands were shaking with something that wasn't fear anymore. I made coffee and started texting the volunteer coordinators she'd identified, asking them to quietly spread the word about the meetings without posting anything online yet. Leo Ramos showed up at my door at 7 sharp, carrying a briefcase and a box of donuts. He spread papers across my kitchen table and started explaining temporary restraining orders while I signed forms wherever he pointed. He kept saying we had a good case, but then listing all the ways grandfather's lawyers would fight us. He needed proof that Westside Properties and Riverside Holdings were actually owned by my grandfather, not just shell companies with no connection. He pulled out more forms for discovery requests and subpoenas, while explaining that judges don't like granting emergency orders without clear evidence of immediate harm. He took photos of my phone showing grandfather's texts and made me write out everything I remembered about his visit to campaign headquarters. He warned me that proving retaliation would be nearly impossible, since landlords can always find technical lease violations to justify evictions. By 8:30, he had 40 pages of legal documents ready to file, but kept shaking his head about our chances. I found Francesca Ortega's number in my old campaign notes and called her from my car while driving to meet Leo at the courthouse. She picked up on the first ring and already knew about the fire from the news coverage. I told her I had information about possible connections to development interests without mentioning grandfather's name yet. She asked pointed questions about timing and documentation while I could hear her typing in the background. She wanted copies of any threats, records of ownership for the buildings where volunteers lived, and a timeline of events leading up to the fire. She explained she'd been investigating housing corruption for 3 years and had sources who might help connect the dots. She couldn't promise anything without seeing evidence first, but agreed to meet once I had more documentation pulled together. The burned community center still had yellow tape around it when I met Mia Donaldson from the fire department at noon. She walked me through where they'd found burn patterns and asked detailed questions about when I'd noticed the smoke and who'd been at the victory party. She took notes in a small notebook while I explained about the election results coming in right before the fire started. She couldn't say much about the investigation, but mentioned they were treating it as suspicious based on preliminary findings. She asked for my personal cell number and said she might have follow-up questions that couldn't go through official channels. She looked at the building for a long moment before telling me to be careful and maybe think about staying somewhere else for a few nights. Alejandro Guerra called me while I was still standing outside the burned building and asked if we could meet immediately. He'd been up all night going through old records about the clinic closure and found patterns I needed to see. We met at a diner where he spread out maps and timelines showing how grandfather's companies had systematically targeted properties near transit lines and medical facilities. The clinic wasn't just valuable land, it was part of a bigger plan to force people out of the whole neighborhood. He showed me emails he'd gotten through public records requests that proved the closure was planned 2 years before it happened. He offered to share everything with whatever legal team I was building and started making calls to other advocates who'd been fighting similar battles. We spent 3 hours going through documents while he explained how each piece connected to the bigger picture of systematic displacement. The campaign team gathered at 4 to draft a statement about the fire that wouldn't give grandfather's lawyers any ammunition. We went through 12 drafts, carefully removing any suggestion of arson or connection to the threats. The final version just expressed sadness about losing a place that meant so much to our community and thanked the fire department for their quick response. We posted it on social media and sent it to local news outlets while watching the response numbers climb. People started sharing memories of the community center and offering to help rebuild without knowing someone had burned it down on purpose. The organizer fielded calls from reporters while making sure everyone stuck to the approved message about focusing on the future instead of speculating about the cause. At 6 that evening, a courier arrived at my apartment with an envelope marked urgent from grandfather's law firm. The cease and desist letter claimed I was planning to make defamatory statements that would damage his business reputation. It threatened legal action if I made any public statements connecting him to the fire or suggesting criminal behavior. Leo actually laughed when I sent him photos of it, saying they'd just given us evidence of their panic. He added it to our growing file and started drafting a response that basically told them to pound sand in legal language. The next morning, my phone rang at 6, and Estella's voice was breaking as she told me about the eviction notice that had just been posted on her door. 30 days to get out for lease violations they claimed happened months ago, but were only being addressed now. She'd knocked on 2,000 doors for our campaign, and now she was going to be homeless because of it. She kept apologizing like it was her fault, while I wrote down every detail about the notice, and promised we'd fight it. Within an hour, 12 more volunteers called with the same story and the same 30-day deadline. I met Francesca at a coffee shop downtown, where she reviewed everything I'd gathered so far. She studied the ownership documents Leo had found and took photos of grandfather's threatening texts. She explained she needed at least 2 independent sources for everything before her editor would let her publish anything connecting him to the fire. She already had researchers looking into the shell companies, but warned me these investigations take time. She asked about other volunteers who might talk on the record and started building a database of everyone affected by the evictions. She promised to protect sources, but said the story would be stronger if some people went public with their experiences. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Mia, saying they'd found traces of accelerant at multiple points in the building, but needed more testing before making it official. She warned me to start varying my daily routes, and maybe avoid being alone in isolated places. She couldn't say more through text, but suggested we meet in person soon to discuss what they were finding. 3 days later, Alejandro called me while I was sorting through what was left of our campaign files, and said he knew someone at the State Attorney General's office who might help with the housing stuff. Cassandra Lovell worked in their housing discrimination unit, and Alejandro had already sent her the basic information about the eviction threats. I drove to the state building that afternoon and found her office on the 4th floor, where she had boxes of case files stacked everywhere. She listened to everything about the 43 volunteers facing eviction and took notes on a yellow legal pad while asking specific questions about dates and names. She explained that state intervention in local housing disputes needed proof of a pattern across multiple counties and suggested I start looking for similar problems in other cities where grandfather owned property. She gave me her direct phone number and said to call if we found more evidence, but warned me these cases usually took months or years to build. On the drive back to campaign headquarters, our tech lead called in a panic because he'd just discovered that half our donor records were destroyed in the fire, which meant we couldn't prove where our campaign money came from. He was at his computer trying to rebuild what he could from bank statements and old emails, but tons of small cash donations from bake sales and car washes had no paper trail now. The incumbents' people would definitely use this against us if they challenged the election results, since we couldn't prove our funding was legitimate. I told him to keep working and document everything he could recover while I figured out what to do next. That night, while helping him go through bank records, we noticed something weird in our campaign email account, showing 12 failed login attempts from IP addresses we didn't recognize. Someone had been trying to break into our accounts for the past 3 days, using different passwords each time. We immediately changed all our passwords and turned on two-factor authentication for everything, while wondering what else grandfather might be trying to access. The tech lead installed new security software and started checking all our other accounts for suspicious activity. 2 days later, Mom had her follow-up appointment at the cancer center, and there was no way to move it without risking her health. The cancer center was in one of grandfather's medical buildings, and walking through those doors made me feel sick, knowing he controlled everything inside. I went with her and sat in the waiting room, looking at all the other patients who didn't know their landlord owned this place too. The nurse called Mom back for her blood work and scans while I stayed in the lobby, watching people come and go through the automatic doors. Every doctor here paid rent to grandfather's company and could lose their office space if they crossed him. Mom came out an hour later with good news about her blood counts, but I couldn't even celebrate properly knowing we were in his building. We walked to the parking garage in silence, and I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see his security guards or lawyers waiting for us. That same afternoon, Estella called a meeting at the library for all the volunteers facing eviction, and 12 of them showed up ready to fight. They decided to form an emergency tenants council to share information and support each other through the eviction process. Estella took charge immediately and started organizing them into committees for legal research and media outreach and mutual aid. Watching these people who might lose their homes still fighting for each other gave me more strength than anything else that week. They scheduled daily check-ins and created a phone tree so nobody would face this alone. The next morning, my personal phone rang with a blocked number, and when I answered, grandfather's voice filled my ear with fake concern about the fire at the community center. He said he'd heard about the tragedy and wondered if our family could talk about it together since we'd all been through so much. I hit the record button on my phone while he kept talking about how dangerous old buildings could be and how sometimes bad things happen to good people. He suggested we meet for coffee to discuss the situation like family instead of enemies, and made vague references to more problems if we didn't find common ground soon. I kept my voice steady and told him I was too busy with transition planning to meet, but would think about his offer. He said he'd call again soon and reminded me that families should stick together during difficult times before hanging up. 10 minutes later, the incumbent mayor's chief of staff called our main campaign line to inform us that they were considering challenging the election results due to the destroyed records. He said the lack of documentation raised questions about whether proper procedures were followed, and they had a duty to ensure election integrity. The organizer immediately started calling volunteers to gather sworn affidavits from every single voter we'd registered while we still had people's memories fresh. We had 3 days to collect 8,000 statements before the certification deadline. Everyone dropped what they were doing to help track down voters and get their signatures on legal documents. That evening, I got an email from someone named Titus Aguirre, who said he worked at grandfather's company and had information about the health clinic closure. He was scared to meet anywhere near the office, but suggested a coffee shop across town where nobody from the company would see us. We set up a meeting for the next morning, and I asked Leo to come with me for safety and to witness whatever Titus wanted to share. Titus showed up 20 minutes early and sat in the back corner booth looking around nervously every few seconds. He pulled out a folder with printed emails from 2 years ago showing grandfather's company discussing the clinic land as a development opportunity before it even closed. The emails talked about strategies to make the clinic fail financially so they could buy the land cheap. Titus's hands shook as he explained he'd kept these documents because he knew it was wrong, but was too scared to do anything until now. He agreed to be a protected source if we could guarantee his name wouldn't be public. 2 days later, we got the court decision on the temporary restraining orders, and only 8 of our volunteers were protected from eviction. The judge said the others didn't have enough evidence of retaliation yet and would need to provide more documentation. Estella was safe for now, but 35 families still faced losing their homes in 3 weeks. Leo immediately started working on appeals, while the Tenants' Council organized protests outside the courthouse. The fire department released their public report that afternoon, listing the cause as undetermined pending further investigation. The report mentioned they were still running tests and interviewing witnesses, but couldn't make any official determination yet. Mia texted me privately 10 minutes after the report went public, saying they were building a strong case, but these things took time to do properly, and I needed to be patient while they gathered evidence that would hold up in court. The next morning, Cassandra Lovell from the State Attorney General's office called to schedule an intake interview for 3 days later. She explained right away that the AG needed proof of patterns affecting multiple counties, not just our city. I spent the rest of that day calling activists in nearby towns and discovered 5 other communities where clinics mysteriously closed before luxury developments appeared. Cassandra took notes during our 2-hour meeting, but kept repeating that documentation was everything. She gave me a list of specific records to gather and suggested I look for similar problems in other states too. Meanwhile, the community had already started raising money to rebuild the burned center. Within 48 hours, people donated $30,000 through car washes and bake sales and GoFundMe pages. The problem was, we couldn't touch a single brick, while the fire department still had it marked as a potential crime scene. That money just sat in a bank account while kids had nowhere to do homework after school. The seniors who used to get free lunches there now went hungry. The support groups that met in that building had to crowd into church basements. 3 nights after the fire, I noticed an unmarked sedan parked across from my apartment building. It sat there for 3 straight hours with someone inside just watching. I called the police and 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later. They took my report and walked over to check, but the driver had every right to the park on a public street. The cops said there was nothing they could do unless the person actually threatened me or broke a law. The car left right after the police did, but I saw it again the next morning parked a block away. Our tech lead spent days trying to recover our voter data from various backup sources and personal computers. He managed to piece together about 60% of our registration lists from volunteer emails and spreadsheets. The rest was gone forever, though, including most of our donor records and organizing maps. We'd have to rebuild our entire infrastructure from scratch while already trying to run the city. The volunteers started arguing about whether to go public about grandfather owning their apartment buildings. Half of them wanted complete transparency to show voters what we were up against. The other half worried it would look like I was using public office for a personal family fight. Estella thought we should focus on the eviction threats without naming grandfather specifically. Someone else suggested we wait until we had more evidence from the fire investigation. The debate got heated with people yelling about strategy while their own homes were at risk. Leo advised us to be strategic and not give grandfather's lawyers any ammunition they could use. After 2 days of arguments, we decided to release a careful statement about receiving threats related to development interests. We didn't name anyone specific, but made it clear that powerful people were trying to stop our reforms. The statement went out on social media and immediately started getting shared hundreds of times. People commented with their own stories about being pushed out by developers. Local news picked it up, and suddenly everyone was talking about corruption in city development. Francesca had been investigating for days and finally published her first article connecting the clinic closure to a network of developers. She didn't name grandfather yet, but included enough details that anyone paying attention could connect the dots. The article showed how the same group of companies kept appearing wherever public services closed. She had maps and timelines and quotes from former city employees who confirmed the pattern. The piece went viral locally with thousands of shares in the first few hours. City officials who'd stayed quiet suddenly had to respond to reporters asking about the connections. That afternoon, Titus sent me copies of internal emails from grandfather's company from 2 years before the clinic closed. The emails discussed the clinic land as a perfect opportunity for luxury condos once it became available. One message literally said they should start planning because the clinic would definitely close within 18 months. Titus was shaking when he handed over the printed pages at our meeting spot. He kept looking around and asking if anyone had followed me. He agreed to be a protected source but begged me not to let anyone figure out who leaked the documents. I promised to protect him and immediately gave copies to Francesca and Cassandra and Leo. These emails were exactly the evidence we needed to show the clinic closure wasn't about budget problems. 2 days later, a process server showed up at campaign headquarters with a thick envelope. Grandfather's lawyers had filed a slap suit claiming my public statements were damaging his business reputation. They wanted $2 million in damages and an immediate retraction of everything I'd said. Leo read through the filing and actually laughed at some of the claims. He explained these lawsuits were designed to drain our resources through legal fees, even though we'd probably win. The goal wasn't to win in court, but to exhaust us financially and emotionally. He estimated we'd spend at least $50,000 defending against it, even with him working at reduced rates. That evening, I found Mom crying in the kitchen holding her phone. She'd figured out that grandfather was using her cancer treatment as leverage against me. She kept apologizing over and over for something that wasn't remotely her fault. I held her while she sobbed about being the reason I couldn't fight back properly. She said maybe she should switch oncologists, so grandfather couldn't threaten her care anymore. I told her absolutely not, because her health came first, no matter what. We sat together on the kitchen floor for an hour while she cried, and I promised we'd get through everything together. The next morning, Alejandro called me before I'd even had coffee with papers spread across his desk. He'd spent all night digging through city records and found something that made his voice shake. The community center had 17 code violations reported over the past 3 years, but every single one got marked resolved without any actual repairs. The fire department had flagged bad wiring twice, and the building inspector wrote about water damage making the structure unsafe. Nothing ever got fixed because the previous administration kept signing off on fake repairs that never happened. Alejandro showed me the signatures on every approval form, and they all belonged to the same city official who got campaign donations from developers. The pattern was so clear that even I could see it without any legal training. 2 hours later, I sat across from the incumbent's chief of staff in his office that smelled like old leather and expensive cologne. He leaned back in his chair and actually smiled when I explained about the threats and the fire. He called it all political growing pains and said I'd understand better once I got some experience under my belt. He told me this was how things worked in the real world and suggested I focus on moving forward instead of dwelling on the past. His dismissive tone made my hands clench under the desk, but I kept my face calm while he basically admitted they knew about the corruption all along. That afternoon, the Tenants' Council set up microphones outside City Hall for their press conference about the evictions. Estella stood at the podium with eviction papers in her shaking hands, while 30 other residents lined up behind her. She talked about working 3 jobs to pay rent and still getting a notice because she'd helped my campaign. Her voice broke when she described her kids asking if they'd have to change schools again. One by one, the other tenants shared their stories while reporters took notes and cameras rolled. An elderly man showed medical bills that proved he'd never missed rent until the eviction notice arrived. A single mother held up photos of the mold in her apartment that the landlord never fixed, despite dozens of complaints. The crowd grew bigger as people walking by stopped to listen, and some started crying when they heard familiar struggles. Richard Gentry from the district attorney's office met me in a small conference room the next day with a recorder and thick notebook. He went through every text from grandfather word by word and asked me to explain the exact time each one arrived. He studied the screenshots I'd taken and compared them to phone records his office had already pulled. He asked detailed questions about who else saw the texts and whether I'd told anyone about the threats before the fire. His methodical approach gave me hope that someone was finally taking this seriously, even though he warned me these cases moved slowly. He wrote down every name I mentioned and asked for contact information for witnesses who could verify the timeline. 3 days later, grandfather's lawyer showed up at campaign headquarters with a settlement offer printed on expensive paper. He slid it across the table to Leo, who started reading with his eyebrows climbing higher with each page. The deal said all evictions would stop immediately if I agreed to approve 6 specific development projects once I took office. The projects included tearing down the old library for condos and converting the food bank into retail space. Leo actually laughed out loud when he got to the part about giving grandfather's company exclusive rights to all city construction contracts. The lawyer sat there with a straight face, like this was a normal business proposal instead of straight-up corruption. Leo pushed the papers back and told him we'd need time to consider such a generous offer while trying not to smile. That same week, the incumbent called an emergency city council session to push through a new ordinance about condemning old buildings. The ordinance would let the city declare any building over 40 years old as unsafe without proper inspection. It gave developers the right to buy condemned properties at below market prices with just 30 days' notice. We realized he was trying to lock in grandfather's whole agenda before leaving office in 2 weeks. The council members who supported us tried to delay the vote, but the incumbent's allies had the majority. They passed it 8-5, while residents shouted from the gallery about their homes being stolen. I watched from the back row feeling sick as they basically legalized the theft of half our district. 2 mornings later, Mom came into my room holding her phone with tears running down her face. Someone had leaked her entire medical history to a gossip blog that posted every detail about her cancer treatment. The blog had copies of her chemotherapy schedule and even photos from her medical files showing her weight loss. They'd published our bank statements from when we couldn't afford her medications and screenshots of my desperate messages begging relatives for help. Mom sat on my bed trying to smile while saying it didn't matter what people thought, but I saw her hands shaking. She kept apologizing for becoming a burden on the campaign, even though none of this was her fault. The blog post got thousands of shares in hours, with comments calling us grifters and liars. The court hearing about restraining orders came the next week, and the judge extended protection for most volunteers. But 5 families, including an elderly couple with health problems, still faced eviction in 7 days. We scrambled to find them places to stay, while Leo filed emergency appeals that probably wouldn't get heard in time. Churches offered temporary shelter, and some supporters with extra rooms volunteered space, but breaking up these families felt like letting grandfather win. Francesca's second article came out that afternoon with a deep dive into the shell companies behind the evictions. She'd traced ownership through layers of paperwork to show how Westside Properties and Riverside Holdings connected to dozens of other companies. Her investigation mapped out forced closures of clinics, community centers, and small businesses across the entire city over 10 years. She still didn't name grandfather directly, but included enough details that anyone paying attention could connect the dots. The article included documents showing how property values mysteriously increased right after each closure. She'd interviewed former tenants who'd been forced out, and their stories matched ours perfectly. Meanwhile, Titus called me in panic because his supervisor had started asking why he'd been missing so many meetings. The supervisor mentioned seeing Titus's car at unusual locations and wondered if everything was okay at home. Titus knew this was a warning that they suspected something, but he couldn't quit without losing his health insurance. Leo immediately started working on whistleblower protection paperwork while we documented every interaction Titus had at work. We gave him a burner phone for communication and told him to act normal while keeping copies of any suspicious emails. His fear was so real that he threw up in our office bathroom after signing the whistleblower forms. The next morning, my phone rang at 6 with Zachary Huffman from the arson task force saying the lab results were in and we needed to meet immediately. I drove to the police station where he showed me the report confirming accelerant traces throughout the community center's first floor. He explained that arson cases could take months or even years to prosecute, but they were treating this as priority one given the election timing. His team started pulling security footage from every business within 3 blocks, while I gave them grandfather's threatening texts again. That afternoon, the election board called an emergency meeting to schedule the certification hearing for next week. The incumbent's lawyers filed paperwork challenging 6 precincts where our voter registration drives had the biggest impact. They claimed without the destroyed records we couldn't prove those votes were legitimate. Leo started gathering affidavits from every volunteer who'd registered voters, while our tech lead pulled bank records, showing hundreds of small donations from those same neighborhoods. We worked until 3 in the morning preparing binders of evidence to defend our victory. My elderly neighbor showed up at my door the next day with her famous casserole and sat with me at the kitchen table while I ate. She reminded me that our community had survived before that building existed and would keep surviving no matter what grandfather destroyed. Her simple words helped me remember why we were fighting in the first place. Mom found me looking through the certification hearing documents that evening and asked if she could speak at the hearing about what this election meant to people like her. I worried about her safety with grandfather escalating, but realized her voice might be exactly what the election board needed to hear. We spent the night preparing her statement together while she practiced staying calm and focused. The certification hearing packed the county courthouse with supporters and media filling every seat. When Mom took the microphone, she spoke for exactly 3 minutes about choosing between medicine and rent before our neighbors stepped up to help. She described the hairdresser who shaved her head for free and the mechanic who fixed our car without payment. The room went completely silent as she explained how strangers became family while our actual family abandoned us. She finished by saying this election was about neighbors helping neighbors and giving everyone the chance our community gave her. The election board members wiped their eyes as she sat down. After 6 hours of testimony and reviewing our evidence binders, the board voted 4-1 to certify our victory based on the overwhelming proof from voter affidavits and donation records. The incumbent stood up and promised to monitor the situation for any irregularities, but couldn't stop the certification. We'd officially won despite the destroyed records and grandfather's attempts to steal it from us. 2 days later, grandfather's lawyers expanded their slap suit to include defamation claims seeking $2 million in damages. They claimed my public statements about threats and development interests were destroying his business reputation and causing financial harm. Leo called Marcella Scott, an attorney who specialized in fighting strategic lawsuits meant to silence critics, and she agreed to join our team pro bono. She'd beaten dozens of these cases and immediately started preparing our anti-SLAPP motion. Richard Gentry from the district attorney's office moved forward with a criminal investigation by issuing subpoenas for grandfather's phone records to verify the threatening texts came from his devices. He explained the legal wheels turned slowly, but this was official recognition that criminal behavior had occurred. His investigators started interviewing witnesses and building a timeline of the threats and fire. Meanwhile, the tenants' council that Estella organized had grown to include residents from 12 of grandfather's buildings. They negotiated their first building-wide agreement that prevented retaliation against any resident who'd participated in our campaign. The agreement became a template we planned to spread across every building grandfather owned in the city. Tenants started sharing stories about maintenance ignored for years and rent increases that forced families out. They documented everything while organizing for collective bargaining power. Francesca's investigation reached its climax when she published a detailed exposé that finally named grandfather directly as the controlling force behind decades of healthcare and housing exploitation. Her article included Titus's leaked documents, showing how grandfather's companies deliberately targeted clinics and community services in poor neighborhoods. She mapped out the shell companies, the political connections, and the pattern of forcing closures to grab valuable land. The article showed how he'd stolen healthcare from thousands while building luxury apartments on the ruins. She connected 40 years of suffering to one man's greed and included testimony from families who'd lost loved ones when the nearest hospital became too far away. The story exploded across social media with thousands sharing their own experiences of grandfather's exploitation. Former tenants came forward with stories of illegal evictions and dangerous living conditions. Healthcare workers described how his lobbying had destroyed their clinics. The pressure mounted as reporters from national outlets started calling for interviews. Grandfather's lawyers sent cease and desist letters to everyone, but the truth was already out there, spreading faster than they could contain it. The next morning, I woke up to 30 missed calls and my phone still buzzing with texts from volunteers saying grandfather was on the morning news. I turned on the TV, and there he was in his expensive suit, sitting across from the anchor, looking sad and concerned. He talked about family values and how his own grandchild was using personal disagreements for political gain. He claimed the fire was an accident that I was exploiting and said he'd offered to help our family many times, but we refused. His voice cracked perfectly when he mentioned Mom's cancer and how he'd wanted to be there for us. The anchor nodded sympathetically, while grandfather painted himself as a victim of ungrateful relatives. I threw my shoe at the TV, but it bounced off harmlessly while he kept lying about trying to reconnect with us. Leo called me right as the segment ended and told me not to respond publicly yet. He said the story was already backfiring online, where people were posting screenshots of Francesca's articles next to grandfather's claims. Within an hour, the news station's Facebook page had thousands of comments calling out the lies. People shared their own stories about grandfather's buildings and the clinics he'd closed. The damage control wasn't working because too many people knew the truth now. 3 days later, Zachary Huffman from the arson task force showed up at my apartment with 2 other investigators. They took over the conference room at City Hall and started interviewing everyone who'd been at the victory party. Zachary explained they couldn't name suspects publicly yet, but assured me they were making real progress on the case. He asked detailed questions about the timeline and wanted copies of all the threatening texts again. His team worked through every piece of evidence we'd collected while more investigators examined the fire scene. They found additional evidence of accelerant in places that ruled out accidental causes completely. The investigation moved into high gear with subpoenas going out for security footage from nearby buildings. Zachary warned me this would take months to build a solid case, but promised they were taking it seriously. Meanwhile, Marcella Scott spent hours with me drafting an ethics policy that would keep everything above board. She explained that I'd have to recuse myself from any city decisions involving grandfather's properties or companies. It felt wrong to step aside when his buildings were hurting people, but she said it was the only way to stay legitimate. We wrote out specific procedures for how the deputy mayor would handle those issues instead. The policy covered everything from zoning decisions to code enforcement, so nobody could claim I was using my office for revenge. It took 3 drafts before Marcella was satisfied that we'd covered every possible conflict of interest. The policy went public the same day Richard Gentry got our protective order approved by the court. The order specifically prevented any mass evictions, while the criminal investigation continued, which meant 43 families could stay in their homes. Richard had argued brilliantly that the threatened evictions were connected to the election and potential witness tampering. The judge agreed that tenants shouldn't lose their homes during an active investigation into their landlord. Grandfather's lawyers fought hard, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. The protective order would last at least 6 months, with possible extensions, depending on how the investigation went. 2 weeks later, the court finally ruled on the defamation suit and dismissed most of grandfather's claims against us. The judge wrote that political speech was protected, and grandfather hadn't proven actual malice in our statements. Some procedural issues remained that would drag on for months, but Marcella called it a huge victory. She explained that grandfather would have to pay our legal fees since he'd lost the main claims. The remaining issues were just paperwork that his lawyers would use to save face. We'd won the legal battle even if the war wasn't over yet. That same week, Titus got suspended from his job at grandfather's company for what they called performance issues. He'd worked there 8 years with perfect reviews until he became our source for the investigation. The suspension letter cited vague problems with his attitude and dedication to the company mission. Within hours of the news spreading, our community rallied to support him completely. People started dropping off groceries at his apartment, and someone set up a fund to cover his rent. 3 local businesses immediately offered him jobs, including a better position at a nonprofit focused on housing justice. Titus took the nonprofit job and became even more committed to exposing grandfather's corruption. His suspension backfired completely and gave him freedom to speak more openly about what he'd witnessed. A month before my swearing-in, grandfather showed up in the City Hall parking lot when I was leaving a transition meeting. He stood by my car in his expensive coat, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He demanded I stop the circus and think about what this was doing to the family name. His voice stayed calm, but his hands shook as he talked about our family's reputation being destroyed. I looked at him standing there in his $1,000 shoes and remembered Mom crying during chemo. I told him the family ended the day he hung up on me when I called crying for help. Then I walked past him to my car without looking back while he stood there alone in the empty parking lot. The swearing-in ceremony happened at Jefferson Elementary instead of City Hall because we wanted it accessible to everyone. Hundreds of supporters filled the gymnasium, including every single person who'd helped during Mom's cancer. Our elderly neighbor sat in the front row with her casserole dish because she'd insisted on bringing food. The hairdresser who'd shaved Mom's head stood with the mechanics who'd fixed our car for free. The lunch lady brought my little brother's whole class to watch the ceremony. Even the corner store owner closed his shop for an hour to be there with us. The ceremony stayed simple and focused on service instead of celebration or fancy speeches. After taking the oath, My very first act as mayor was signing the executive order creating the Emergency Housing Stabilization Task Force. Estella Brooks would lead it along with other tenants who'd faced eviction threats during the campaign. The task force had real power to investigate retaliation and recommend immediate interventions to protect renters. We gave them a budget and staff to actually make changes instead of just writing reports. They started work immediately reviewing every eviction filed in the past year for patterns of retaliation. 2 days later, Mom went for her latest scans at the cancer center, trying not to think about grandfather owning the building. The results came back showing she was still in complete remission with no signs of the cancer returning. She cried happy tears in the office while I held her hand and thanked every power I could think of. That afternoon, she decided she wanted to carefully become an advocate for healthcare access in our community. She joined Alejandro's group, but promised to protect her health and not overdo it like she always did. Her first meeting was just listening to other survivors share their stories of fighting for treatment. 3 days after that meeting, a woman from the Regional Health Foundation called my office asking about our plans for the burned community center. She explained they had a new grant program for communities affected by healthcare access issues and wanted to offer matching funds for any money we raised locally. The catch was that the community had to control the rebuilding process, not city government or private developers. I called an emergency meeting with Estella and the other volunteers who'd used the center's services. We spent 4 hours drawing up plans on butcher paper, listing every program we wanted to bring back and adding new ones based on what people needed most. The foundation representative came to our next meeting and watched as 50 people presented their ideas for the new center. She took notes, while a single mom explained how the old center's daycare had let her keep her job. A diabetic teenager showed her the insulin storage problems at his school that the center used to help with. The foundation approved $2 million in matching funds on the spot, but only if we created a community board with real decision-making power. I sit in my new office now, looking at the stack of papers on my desk. Grandfather still owns half the buildings downtown through his shell companies. The arson investigation moves forward, but Zachary says these cases take forever to prosecute. The 43 families are safe for now, but the court orders won't last forever. Tomorrow, we start interviewing architects who understand what community-driven design really means. Tonight, though, those families sleep without worrying about eviction notices, and that's something. Well, that's the dramatic ending you didn't know you needed. If you're still here, I'm equal parts impressed and concerned. Might as well subscribe and see what happens next.